Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have the Data for Good seminar series hosted by the Center for Computing Systems and Data Science. We're honored today to have our distinguished speaker, Professor IanFoster from Argonne National Lab and University of Chicago. And Argonne National Lab, Yan is the director of the Data Science and Learning Division. And Chicago, he's the Arthur Holey Compton Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Computer Science. Yan is a distinguished scientist. His research interests including high-performance computing, computing systems, and data-driven science, which is quite fitting with the center. Yan has won multiple awards in his distinguished career. I will not list all of them, but just to mention, early on, he won the Golden Bell Prize for C, and most recently, he's the winner of the Kennedy Award from IEEE, and also the IEEE Internet Award this year. So we're very happy to have Yan here, and it's yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Some of you know I tried to come earlier in the year, but got stuck in some traffic in Chicago and missed my flight. Much nicer to be here in what seems to be almost summer. Right, so I'm from Argonne in Chicago. Actually, originally I'm from this thing in the bottom left here, New Zealand, but that was a long time ago. What I like to do is to build computer systems, usually motivated by the requirements of scientific applications, just because I find them more interesting than selling ads or distributing videos. So today I want to talk about services we've been building that have as their goal enabling sort of data-driven discovery often on a national scale or a global scale, at least scales that extend beyond an individual lab. How are we doing? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So examples of these might be these are. Now it's working. If I click, oh, it's good. Good, it's working now. So examples might be, for example, and these are things that these are all things that we're involved in to varying degrees. Enabling people from around the world to share and collaborate, share and intercompare results from different general circulation models. This is something that is done with the Earth System Grid Federation, which is something that we set up many years ago and in fact have recently got involved in running again. Or a very different sort of application, but certainly very timely, in collecting data from labs around the world regarding COVID variants, and then combining that with supercomputer models, machine learning, AI methods, and the like, to attempt to predict likely or potential variants of concern that may emerge as a result of viral evolution. It's a fascinating application, actually, of large language models, which I won't say more about, but it's very, very interesting. Another application that's of particular interest to me at the moment is working out how to connect various forms of scientific instruments to remote computers to enhance their capabilities. And I'll give one example here. We're working with people at the Stanford National Synchrotron analysis of data from high-energy diffraction microscopy experiments. And there, well, you can do rapid filtering using machine learning models. Yeah, doing it using physics, pure. About 20 minutes. On the other hand, we can redirect the training task to remote supercomputers. In this case, a Cerebras CS2 computer at Argonne, and moving the data, retraining and returning the trained model can be done in just half a minute, roughly 35 times faster. a very wide variety of these sort of interesting smart instrument applications are emerging where we link high-rate instruments with computers that nowadays can be located almost anywhere as long as they're on a high-speed network. And one last example that we're just getting started with, funded by the Department of Energy, is integrating data from many different sources with various forms of simulation models and AI methods to advance studies of urban science and increase resilience of urban systems. Okay, so all of these applications have in common that so we're going to go from this very high-level picture down to the low-level things that I'm mostly going to be talking about. They all depend on integration of distributed resources, computers, storage systems, scientific instruments, which is in principle easy to do, but in practice is impeded by numerous sources of what we might call friction. So Paul Edwards wrote this book about meteorological and climate modeling where he talked about data friction. So here we've got maybe infrastructure friction, the high costs associated with moving from moving data from where we want to be to where it needs to be, or accessing instruments or accessing high-performance computing systems. So we've been engaged in developing lubricants for such friction for some time. So one thing I should point out is that, for a long time, telecommunications were the problem, but increasingly they're not. Things like ESNet, Internet 2, other networks worldwide now connect us at 100 gigabits per second, 400 gigabits per second, soon a terabit per second. And then we also have emerging networks like 5G networks, free space optics technologies that connect us even if we're located in the field rather than in a nicely connected building like Columbia University or Argonne or the University of Chicago. And we're not going to talk about physics here, but it's sort of fun to think about how we could rephrase this saying from Hermann Minkowski, who talked about the fact that, when he's talking about Einstein's theory of relativity, space and time sort of become vaguely interchangeable or interrelated. Similarly, perhaps, in computing, we can compute now wherever we want, and it's just a question of which is faster when we take into account the time required to get to where the computing is and the speed that we see when we get there. We exist in some sort of computing continuum, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. Anyway, let's look at these issues of friction. So I'm going to identify three things that are hard to do if we want to build distributed scientific computing infrastructures, and explain how we address each of them. And they'll all seem low level and maybe mundane, but we sort of like mundane things, and mundane things end up being useful, as we'll see. So the first thing that's hard is simply acting on resources, accessing data on remote storage systems, accessing remote computers, interfacing to control remote scientific instruments, robotic labs, or whatever it may be, due to various issues like varying interfaces, behaviors, reliability, security, and so forth. So I'll explain how we deal with that in a minute. The second thing that's hard is ensuring reliability. So we want to be able to perform sequences of actions in many cases. For example, perform a machine learning operation on the output of every climate simulation that we want to include in a ensemble. And each of those may be located in an environment in which failures may occur. So we need ways of dealing with those failures. And there's all sorts of failures that we have to deal with. We'll say more about those in a minute. And then finally, perhaps the most difficult and challenging is managing who's trusted to perform what, where, and when. And I think we're all used to negotiating, if we use remote systems, negotiating the access protocols and authority that will allow us to access a remote system. We want to be able to do this on a very large scale in a completely automated manner. So new methods are required in order to. And at the bottom, I mentioned something which is important. We want to be able to not just access remote computers ourselves, but allow programs to do it on our behalf. So we need mechanisms for delegating authority, which ends up being a very important thing to be able to do. Let's go through each of those in turn. So first of all, acting anywhere. So we want to be able to access data systems, compute systems, scientific instruments. And of course, people have been building systems for and tools and methods for addressing that requirement for many years, dating back probably to the very first days of the internet, actually before the internet when it was the Argonne. But none of them, in our view, address the unique set of requirements that arise in some of the scientific applications that we're dealing with. I won't go into detail why, but we can come back to that if you want. But what we've been doing actually for some 20 years now at least, and with increasing degrees of refinement, is building mechanisms that allow us to deploy very lightweight agents near any resource that we want to be able to access, whether the storage system, the compute system, the scientific instrument, using specialized protocols that allow us to move data or access computers with very high performance, modular architectures that allow us to address data regardless of what sort of storage system it's located in, and then integrating with mechanisms I'll describe in a minute for secure delegation of authority and for management of reliability. So I'll say more about those in a second, but Globus Connect and Globus Compute are two of these agents that we've developed. The second thing we need to be able to do is to reliably execute sets of actions. I gave one example, running a federated learning application across many different sites. Another could be, as in our middle example here, integrating data sources, computing resources for more training, perhaps feedback to drive new experiments and such like. So again, many people have worked on techniques for doing this. Workflow systems have been many sorts. There have been hundreds of them. People have tried using distributed file systems to provide reliable access to data. At a different level, consistency protocols, event protocols. Again, we find that for the things we're trying to do there, they're either too complex, specialized, or lack the reach down to the potentially thousands of, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of locations where computing and data may occur. So our approach here is seemed a little bit radical when we started it about 10 years ago, but now it seems fairly routine. We leverage the wonderfully sophisticated commercial cloud industry to run what we call hosted research supervision services that allow us to provide, for example, replication of state, fault tolerance, event failure detection, state management in such ways that if someone asks for some large number of things to happen, the user doesn't have to be concerned about how to ensure that it happens reliably. We can delegate that task to these cloud-hosted services, which we can pretty much ensure run with very close to 100% reliability. I guess we normally run at about 5 nines of reliability, which seems to be enough for science applications. And this also addresses other needs like reducing the complexity of the logic that needs to be deployed at endpoints, reduces application complexity, and can also address things like high security for very sensitive data. Okay, and then the third thing we want to be able to do is to control who can perform what actions, when, and where. So, for example, I start my program to do federated learning across multiple sites. So I'm not going to go and log into each of those sites individually. Instead, I want to be able to assign to a program that will act on my behalf, perhaps the federated learning application, the right to be able to perform certain actions at each of 2, 10, 100 sites, each of which control access to suitable computing and storage resources. And I want that program that I'm giving this authority to have that authority, but no more authority, because of course we don't, if someone hijacks it, we don't want them to be able to do wrong things other than simply run federated learning applications. So in the past, people have built, of course, a whole range of distributed security systems. Some of us have probably used things, passwords, public key infrastructure, Kerberos. The grid security infrastructure was used extensively in the 90s and 2000s. But they all have various complexity and usability concerns. So what we've been building over the last several years and now widely deployed is a system that leverages techniques like OAuth, some of you heard of, the now very widely deployed identity provider federations, and implements secure delegation protocols so that we can tell programs what they're allowed to do, and they can then negotiate access to resources, very little involvement by humans. And I've got a little example here to show this. It's maybe seem a bit complicated, but here I've got a user who wants to run a workflow, a flow that perhaps involves actions in multiple locations and different institutions, countries. And they initially grant a consent to a flow service, one of our hosted supervision services, to do a certain set of things, run certain programs at certain locations. For example, the function F at location A, to be very abstract. That flow service can then go ahead and store access tokens that can then be retrieved later by the program on behalf of, that's acting on behalf of the user. Flow can then say, I want to run this function on this computer. The compute, another hosted service, can retrieve that token, and then finally go ahead and run the program on the remote computer system. And all the user had to do at the beginning was say, run flow with a certain set of consents. Everything else is handled via widely deployed standard protocols with modest extensions for delegation. But we can ensure that when F runs at the right place, it's only this program that's running, and it's only running where the user originally said it was able to run. And I'll say a few more words about scale in a minute, but the software we've developed has managed, I think, more than 1 billion access tokens in the last just the last few years. So it's a very widely used and robust system at this point. Okay, so this is what we've got. These set of global services that we have created that allow us to act on resources, execute remote actions reliably. I was particularly proud of this little picture I found on the internet. I hope you can see it. This is Sisyphus, who's delegated to a robot the task of pushing the rock up the hill, presumably reliably. And then distributed authentication systems with delegation. And these services themselves then allow people to build a much richer, an even richer set of higher level services that handle other things. And I'll give you some examples of those in a minute. But let's say a few words about how we've actually deployed this. So, I work at the University of Chicago and Argonne, as I said. I'm in the computer science department, but we also have established at the university a separate unit called Globus that operates this Globus platform for the research community. It's supported by subscribing institutions, used by a very large number of people, and basically operates these services in a way that allows any scientist or actually anyone to use them. And there's a few nice stats here: 400,000 registered users. These endpoints that I showed you earlier, there's now 54,000 of them registered. More than 1,600 institutions, so I'm sure Columbia has Globus endpoints. We're moving large amounts of data. People are using this on a global scale. And I think I've got another. Oh yeah. So this is what zooming down, where are these endpoints? Well, this is an example. This is the advanced photon source at Argonne, high brilliance light source that basically has 60 beam lines. Essentially every beam line has a Globus endpoint that it uses to access data. And then there are these Globus compute endpoints for computing located on those sort of big computers at the system. And what this means, it's a nice picture, but what it means is that increasingly people used to go to the advanced photon source, like many scientific instruments, and take data back on a hard drive. Used to be floppy drives back in the day, I remember. But now they run flows that automatically do things like move the data to their home institution, catalog them in repositories, perform analysis, quality control, and so forth. Because everything would reduce the friction associated with accessing the associated resources. Okay, so I had some fun writing some Python code, so I'm going to show you the results. So here, this is an interesting, I find it at least a fun animation. So I've taken every large transfer up to about a year ago by Globus, where that's a transfer of more than 100 megabytes, and then plotted the transfer size on the y-axis against the great circle distance from the source to the destination, and then colored them according to the speed. The color doesn't come across so well. Let's just run this for a minute or so. So you see, we start off at 2011 when the services went live, and these are, you can see immediately people around the world are using the service. So they're moving stuff. Performance is increasing. It's getting pinker as we go on. Get more things remote. There's a big gap there. That's the Atlantic Ocean, pretty much. There aren't many labs that are 5,000 kilometers apart. This is like the big, these are some big US labs. This is, turns out this peak here is Korea, some climate data. There's a lot of people moving data between Perth and New York. I don't know, it's probably climate data again, but I'm not sure. And I think we've reached the end. But really, it sort of emphasizes to me at least the global scale of how people are using these services and the global scale of science as well. So I was intrigued by this point out here, which is the greatest great circle distance, and it turns out to be between Wellington and Madrid. I grew up in New Zealand, which we know of as the antipodes of. You heard New Zealand called the antipodes? So you have to be a New Zealander or an Australian, I think, to know that term, or perhaps an English person. Basically, antipodes means on the opposite side of, and New Zealand and Australia were always known as the antipodes of Great Britain, which was originally their home country. And so this is actually an old children's atlas from Australia showing the antipodes of New Zealand. And you can see Madrid and Wellington, and they're projected. So you're almost on the opposite sides of the world. That's the furthest transfers, but not quite. Turns out we have a Globus team member who works in Wellington, so maybe he'll move up to around here and do a transfer from there and get the exact distance. Anyway, so that's just show you how global science really operates. Another example of what people have been doing with the transfer service. So the Earth System Grid Federation I mentioned earlier, it distributes climate model into comparison project and other climate simulation data. For a long time, it's been hosted at Livermore Lab. And people generate simulations from around the world, but they move a copy of them all, the outputs, to Livermore. For various reasons, those data are now being replicated to Argonne National Lab and Oak Ridge National Lab. Corresponds to about 7.5 petabytes, so 15 total, replicating it to 2 labs. So we performed this task using this Globus transfer service. About a year ago, involved, as I say here, 15 petabytes, 17,000 directories, 28,000 files. This is a thing showing how it went. so the blue line is the transfer to Argonne, the red line is the transfer to Oak Ridge. Mostly we transferred first to Argonne and then on to Oak Ridge, but sometimes it went the other way. It was depending on what happened. CMIP6, the more recent simulations moved very quickly because there's lots of large files. We had some errors and issues at the end systems, not in the Globus service, when moving CMIP5, which had many more smaller files. But this whole transfer basically occurred completely automatically, just with someone sitting there putting a button, and then over 3 months we were able to move the 15 petabytes of data, which I think is a testament both to the power of our networks today and the power also of these mechanisms that we've developed that allow us to do such things rapidly, efficiently, and reliably. Okay. So I'll give you a few other examples so going back just a second. So here remember I said hosted supervision service. We've got the universally deployed, we've got 50,000 or so of these endpoints that sit on storage systems and compute systems and other things worldwide. And then we've got these hosted services that manage tasks that involve the use of one or more of these endpoints. And transferring data is one such thing, moving data from A to B or from A to B, C, and D or other more complex scenarios. Computing, managing and performing computation is another such thing. Organizing sequences of tasks. In fact, one we're implementing at the moment in Earth System Grid Federation is flows that will handle the publication task of taking a new climate model simulation output, performing quality control on it, extracting metadata, publishing the metadata, moving the data to permanent storage, replicating it to another lab. So a lot of big data science involves those sorts of things. Let's go forward and look at some more of these things. So Globus Compute is one. So this is another one of these hosted services that coordinates activities, in this case on compute endpoints. So this is the Globus Compute service. Imagine this is sitting replicated across the Amazon cloud. We mostly use the Amazon cloud. Got some of these thousands of compute endpoints where things can run. And then simple Python APIs that let us, first of all, we can deploy an agent on a computer. My laptop has one. The Aurora supercomputer at Argonne, soon to be the world's fastest, will have Globus Compute endpoints. The cloud runs them. Then we register functions, and the functions could be something like perform a machine learning analysis on a climate output, or train a machine learning model on some molecular science data. And then we can, in our programs, quickly invoke those functions, essentially without regard to where they're actually going to run. We spent lots of time working out how to optimize these things. There is some overhead associated with going via the cloud, but the actual data movement and execution all occurs on these high-speed endpoints, so things end up running fairly fast in most cases. So I'll give you a couple of examples of what people have been doing with this. So one is federated learning. This is a group led by Ravi Maduri involving various medical scientists. So the interest is in combining data from performing federated learning, so learning without moving the data to a central location across multiple sites. And they built this nice system that lets you register endpoints, which are basically Globus Compute endpoints and Globus transfer endpoints at different locations. They've got some in Norway, Illinois, etc., Broad Institute. And then run federated learning workflows across them with security and delegation and so forth handled appropriately. Another example is, which we see people doing increasingly, is large-scale distributed computing. So, for example, drug screening protocols running, as I showed here, running across different HPC systems. And you might wonder, if you've got one HPC system, why do you need more than one? I guess it's because people are greedy, partly, but also because sometimes if you're doing things like COVID response, you need rapid response, and you may not have availability at one resource, but you might at another. And we expect to be combining those two scenarios for things like climate simulation, machine learning applications. Okay, so this again is making use of Globus compute and Globus transfer systems running on different systems. Some of these are actually in China, and some are in the US. Okay. So that's two of these sort of orchestration supervision services. Transfer, which lets you transfer many things reliably. Compute lets you compute many things reliably. Globus flows is one that we've been developing to allow, as I said, the definition and execution of flows of activities, which may, well, we show here, collecting data from a scientific instrument, moving output to a high-performance computing system for perhaps analysis, quality control, and then publishing the results to storage. But there are many others. This is just, all of these services have simple web interfaces. This is one that sort of shows the results of one of these flows executing. But let me look at some real examples. So I showed this one earlier, right? This is a smart instrument example. So this is managed using Globus flows. In this case, a model. This is the model training flow, transferring data to the AI system, preparing the data, performing model training, and then returning the result from Argonne, in this case, to standard. And this flow is expressed in such a way that you can, this universal data and compute substrate, we can then redirect it to other instruments, perhaps substitute alternative machine learning models without requiring to modify much in the implementation. So an interesting thing here is we're seeing as these, so one of the early adopter of this technology is the advanced photon source at Argonne. This is of the Globus flows technology. We're seeing an increasingly rich set of these flows being developed for various data sources and analysis modalities. And I don't know if you can actually see here, but this is X-ray photon correlation spectroscopy, and they all consist of similar things: moving data, performing computational tasks, running functions, basically published using Globus compute to extract metadata, to perform quality control, perform analysis, create a plot, in this case, publish the data, and so forth. Serial synchrotron crystallography is another modality that's being used extensively. Pligography, high-energy diffraction microscopy. And they're all running now in this, so the Argonne computing facility is changing its nature in a way, in that rather than only running big simulation codes as it's done for years, it's now increasingly running these fine-grained workloads that correspond to the demands of different scientific instruments at the advanced photon source and other locations. And so here I showed running, for example, this flow at the bottom here. There's a whole series of transfer and compute and some cataloging operations, and you can see these, each of these executing over time, and each of those is a function running on a, in this case, a supercomputer. It could also be running on a edge computer at the light source or on a cloud system if required. Okay, so here we go. So I've given this sort of high-level picture of these global services either you're all convinced they're wonderful or you're not, in which case I maybe not be able to reach you. But what I find exciting is we've used computing methods in science, of course, for decades. The cloud came along, and people started saying, well, we should use the cloud for computing. Maybe it's easier or cheaper, and maybe it is, and we can argue about that. But it turns out what you can actually use the cloud for that's really powerful for science is to manage these activities that previously were entirely handled manually, so that you can do things like run these flows using our existing computing and storage resources, but managing them with high reliability and high security thanks to these cloud-hosted services. And meanwhile, of course, and the reason we can do this is partly because of cloud, but partly also because we've got this, our connectivity is now, of course, it's faster. We've moved from 5 gigabits per second to soon 400 gigabits per second, etc. But the networks are also, quasi-ubiquitous and ultra-reliable in a way that they weren't previously. And of course, our computing systems are also more flexible and powerful as well. So we can now link computing and instruments and data together in ways that we couldn't do reliably before. We've been trying to do it for 30 years, but it used to take, weeks to set up a single experiment. Now we can just click a button and these flows will run. Into the future, I think we're going to have zettascale computers. Someone told me. I don't know. I wouldn't hold my breath, but we probably will have three-space optics. We'll have increasing integration of these things in this sort of computing continuum where we access computing without regard to where it's been provided, except that it should be provided in the place that's the most efficient for our particular application. And in order to do this, well, we need some capabilities. We should be able to access data anywhere, regardless of, without friction, I should say. Access compute anywhere without friction. Do this in a way that's totally trusted. And then be able to write applications that can take advantage of this sort of on-demand computing storage environment. And that's what we are working to develop. We continue to work to develop. And I've described some of the things we've been doing here. So an interesting sort of philosophical point is we're all, at least some of the young ones here, maybe not, but we're all aware of how, most of us are aware of how the pendulum has swung over the years from centralization to decentralization. Mainframes, and then workstations, or PCs, and then utility computing, the grid in the 90s, to the cloud, which seemed to be the ultimate centralization in a sense. But now we're realizing that we need to compute also near to the devices that produce the data we want to analyze. So now perhaps we're seeing some sort of merging of these two things in this computing continuum. So this here is a cloud data center, by the way, and the array of things is a urban sensor network developed in Chicago. So the neat thing is, as this pendulum swings back and forth, we've solved a whole set of problems, I think, that previously were just big sources of friction. So authorization, universal connectivity, location-independent computing, certainly a lot easier than it used to be. How to program these distributed workflows. Then we've got all these new opportunities and challenges. So we're getting new devices of all sorts, edge devices, new applications. The ones I talked about at the beginning of this presentation, the things that we didn't really think about doing 20 years ago. We didn't do them on the scale. The performance and scale at which we're running things is so much bigger. The fact that we talk about training large language models over tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of COVID sequences is astonishing. And the fact that we can then do that at a speed and in a scale that we can then feed back to decide what COVID sequences we should be looking for in the field is really exciting. And then we have other things like energy has become this new sort of quasi-ubiquitous constraint. We still have much to do in the sort of building out a global data space architecture, which I could say more about. And despite our progress in programming these things, we have a lot more to do. So these are some of the questions that we're interested in. As we start to deploy ubiquitous 5G and 6G and free space optics networks, what will they look like in practice? How do we make these energy versus accuracy trade-offs? I think computer scientists are still mostly interested in, understanding scalability of algorithms or their efficiency according to fairly simple metrics, but we might have more complex metrics we want to evaluate. Where should we be placing computing and storage? Cloud data centers are very nice. Institutional data centers have a role to play as well, but there are probably other sorts of computing locations we should be evaluating. On the instrumentation side, there's a whole set of new instruments that I think we're going to see emerging. I'm particularly focused on the advanced photon source because that's near to my office. It's only a few microseconds away from my office, a kilometer. Where we're, with the upgrade that we're undergoing now, we're going to be generating data at maybe terabytes per second. What instruments will we build if we can actually link simulation and machine learning in the loop there as we collect those data? But many more of that sort will be provided. I could carry on. And maybe at some point we'll integrate quantum sensors. Maybe not computers, but all right. So actually, I finished fairly quickly, so hopefully there'll be a few questions. Hopefully I've given some flavor of what we're about. What I didn't say, and I meant to say, is what we're really interested in doing is finding people who have interesting things they want to do now that we've got this global data and compute fabric. We've got ideas of our own. We're working with lots of people, but there's many more opportunities that have yet to be explored. And of course, I've only listed a few of the colleagues who I work with. Many others, some wonderful students at the University of Chicago. This is a paper we recently put out that talks about some of these flows, how they work in practice. There's some other URLs. So thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ian, for the lecture.
There's a chat question, probably someone saying that they couldn't hear it.
I think Alexis was asking the audience online whether anyone have questions, but we can maybe start with the people in the room.
Yeah. I'm always fascinated by how much of science and collaboration will just be done by computers. I wonder whether you have any insights into how
much science and collaboration?
Yeah, I guess at some point it could be limited by the speed of the networks and the algorithms you can put in there.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that back in the 17th century when Racine was sending around letters, with the latest discoveries, and now and that was well changing. Yeah. So I'm interested in the question. Of course, we collaborate at much greater scales than we used to, and probably we need to study the problems that we're studying, but also often by very inefficient processes. So how could we automate more of the tasks like finding what information is available on a particular problem that we're asking, or quickly constructing a simulation of a complex system that we want to much more to be done there. Yeah.
I guess I think it's very exciting to have that kind of fabric and then be able to do compute where you need, take the data where you want, do the analysis where you want. One of the tensions, though, I think that's developing in the whole universe of open access, open data, et cetera, is when you flip the switch or transition from the different phases of collecting the data, the first level digestion, the analysis, the publication, et cetera. I was wondering how the tools in Globus allow you to control that, keep it private when it needs to be within the collaboration group, and then also make it public and archivable, especially because you can now have terabytes of data, and I don't think anyone wants that open, but, you know.
Well, some people do.
They say they do. And they may actually, I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's like, raw data is often
One thing various people are doing is using some of the flow mechanisms I described to implement publication flows, you know, so that data gets ingested automatically, perhaps cataloged, registered, and then, you know, perhaps on the basis of some fixed policy, become public at some point in the future. I think as a broader question is, you know, what data do we want to be public, and what does it mean to make data public? So of course we're all making all our data open now because we have to. But what does that mean in practice? You know, most data will never be accessed by anyone. Some will be accessed by, or should be accessed by many people. And there are certainly examples of, well, so look at, for example, the various genomic databases. So people started sharing genomic data quite early on, putting it into GenBank and so forth. And there was a time when everyone was busy downloading those data to their local machines and building computers to analyze it. That's perhaps becoming increasingly untenable. So now the NIH runs things like the Genomic Data Commons, which allows you to compute on data that's been contributed by others. So maybe there's a new sort of resource that is needed for those sorts of things. They cost money, so where do we decide to spend the money? Yeah.
And so this is really interesting, and I'm trying to understand if this Globus infrastructure would also be relevant for people like my group, who is running more low throughput, smaller data simulations. But one important question is, we have relied for decades now on free and open source software like SSH and SFTP to transfer our data, to access remote resources. How much of the Globus infrastructure is FOSS and how much is licensed?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, and first of all, you know, SSH and SFTP, you know, work well for a certain set of things. You know, if you don't need super high performance and you only want to access one computer, well, why not? Why not use that? We're speaking, our focus is on various dimensions of scale, complexities of process, large sizes of data, number of resources. And then the question is, well, how do we develop and distribute our software? So it's a mix of open source and closed source components. Most of the software that you download and run on your machines is open source, but the cloud hosted supervision services is closed source, run by this, you know, not-for-profit group at the University of Chicago, and that is for partly a question of philosophy and partly a question of experience. We think that for these things to succeed, they have to have economies of scale so that everyone uses one central, or ideally everyone uses one central service so that you're not negotiating with half a dozen of them. And the way we're doing it at the moment seems to empower that. We have had experience in the past, I would say, also of producing similar things 20 years ago that were entirely open source, and it was interesting to watch how there were soon a dozen copies of this being done, all competing with each other. So, for better or worse, we've adopted this approach. Yeah.
But are the APIs available to such an extent that others could perhaps later on implement? Or
Yes. The APIs, everything where I didn't really say anything about that here. I don't know. I think I removed the slide, but we have, you know, open, you know, documented, actually very simple APIs for every element of this, so you can program against it, and you could also replicate. And this is important, for example, when someone comes up with a new storage technology, which people seem to do with increasing frequency. They typically go off and then re-implement the storage API, often based on our software, to allow integration of that storage into the ecosystem. Yeah.
I guess I also wanted to link into the sort of open science aspect of it. So if we assume we have a publicly hosted data set, how would someone who's not involved in any of like a big institution that does have a Globus endpoint would potentially get access to this? Or would there be a model for paying for the compute that sort of acts on public data sets? Or
Right, so this, I'm not sure but I'll try and answer, and you tell me if I got it wrong. So, I mean, first, I don't think you're asking the following, but, you know, anyone can download the Globus client software and run it on their computer. It's only some premium bits that we give to subscribers, just so to encourage them to subscribe. But I think you're saying more if there's a large, you know, there's a terabyte or a petabyte data set somewhere, say at Argonne, and I want to analyze it. How do I do that? Well, I could hope that Argonne is running has some sort of generally open service that will let me do things, which, you know, that's what we're doing with the Earth System Grid Federation. We're standing up a service that will allow anyone to perform certain numbers of computations up to the total number of resources that are available there. Or you could download all the software or move it to a cloud service and run your computations there. So the main thing we're trying to do is make it reduce the barriers to moving things around. So you can't compute in one place and move somewhere else.
but you could stand up the whole stack basically.
You could
on your local computer if you want to, and then later.
I think that's.
I mean, obviously that's.
It's easy to say that it
You do that.
to say that will become increasingly unfeasible, but in practice, have a power law distribution of data sizes. So most analyses will be something that we can do on our local computers, and then there'll be a set of interesting ones that we can only do at a massive scale, and for that we probably need some national scale or international scale collaborative teams formed to assemble the resources to perform those analyses.
Yeah. With the software-defined networking, software-defined X,
yes,
the software-defined fabrics that we're creating, how is that impacting the architecture of Globus?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. Software-defined X, I'd say for the most part it's had little impact so far because we don't see much of that being deployed at scale in the environments in which we work. But I hope that it will become more widely deployed and we can make more use of it. We have some people using Globus who've done things like, in order to move data, they need to dynamically open ports in the firewall to enable routes through it. And that's sort of like a software-defined network, a very simple sort. People have used callouts in the software to establish those sorts of things. We've done some work with negotiating quality of service guarantees over certain links. And that hasn't been too common, mostly because most of the networks we work with are provisioned. But I hope that we'll see more of that in the future.
So I have a couple comments from virtual. So many of the docs and many of the APIs discussed are available at docs.globus.org. That was just a comment.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Ben. That was Ben Blazek, I bet.
Yep. And then another question, how can the use of SSTP be approved in the future to allow higher data transfer rates or manage larger volumes of data?
So SSTP is, I assume, some data transfer.
As FTP?
Sorry? Maybe SFTP.
Could be SFTP. Anyway, why don't I just, what are the techniques that Globus uses? So the Globus data transfer architecture is, in a sense, fairly simple. There's as I mentioned, we have these endpoints at different locations, a cloud service that you ask it to do something, like move these 100 or million files from A to B, and then it manages that process. But in managing that process, there's a lot of clever things that go on. So one is, many computing facilities now run arrays of what are called data transfer nodes, which are nodes running Globus endpoint software that are set up to allow very fast access to the storage systems. It's often the storage system access that's the rate limiting step in these data movements. So we have these arrays of data transfer nodes. The Globus cloud service then negotiates when you're moving one or more files from A to B to set up a whole series of parallel communication channels. So you might have tens or more of communication channels that are set up moving data from one set of these data transfer nodes to another. It's also then configuring things like the BP buffer size and other parameters. It's, scheduling transfers, so there's always multiple transfers on the go. You're not transferring one file and then waiting to be sure it's there and returning to transfer the next one. And there are other sort of optimizations of that sort, and they all turn out to be important in different use cases. You're moving a few big files, many small files over a long round-trip time network versus a small network. Different sorts of storage systems or file systems require different techniques and so on. So I guess, if you're going to use some other software, you want to incorporate all of those techniques into that software to do these things. If you're just using client software to move something from A to B, you'll always have this problem of being able to detect, monitoring what's happening, detecting things like failure and recovering from them, which the cloud-hosted software, I think, makes easier. Yeah.
So there's a kind of a level of services that I've thought about for a while, which is more at the computational level and exploiting the fact that, there's computing in the network too. For instance, let's say extrapolating and interpolating services. So, you have a grid, a fluid, ocean model, and you have a atmospheric model,
Yep.
Common occurrence, right, coupled model. So your meshes are different, right? Has Globus explored being able to make that friction less, where, programmers have to then figure out how they interoperate these different meshes?
No. First of all, no. I mean, I'm familiar with those issues, and I know people who have looked at them and worked on them a bit, but for the most part, we've been focused primarily on sort of moving files from one place to another. We're doing some work with streaming. And we're starting to look at some light source applications that involve data transformation en route, but we haven't done too much with that. I agree, it's very interesting.
And then a similar question, a lot of your workflows are linear.
Yes.
But if you're doing like co-design, you have a couple models and iterating. So,
of course.
Is Globus doing that kind of applications? Those kind of applications?
Yeah, we should be. So there's lots of debate as to how best to handle that. There are some wonderful workflow systems that manage arbitrarily rich networks. We're trying to focus on a fairly narrow set of use cases that involve transformation of data, but of course we need iteration and additionals and so forth. So so far we're doing those in a sort of ad hoc manner, higher level programs, but we probably should do better than that. Yeah.
Thank you. How much does it cost to build these system tools?
So you mean how much have we spent building?
Exactly.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
So I don't know that answer, but I'll say, the Globus team at the University of Chicago, which is supported by, initially we were supported by grants that helped us prototype things, but it's now supported by subscribers, about 40 people. So some of those, user support, some people developing new features, some people operate the cloud services, but that gives you some sense of modest. For an academic service, I think it's quite large. In any other context, it's a small service, a small group. Yeah.
curious, so suppose I have some application I want to register as my f of x. I mean, this assumption of containerization, is that how you're getting the abstraction in this? How would I do that?
Yeah, so it's right. So that's sort of an important edge case, right? So we're using containers. You can just, if it's just a simple Python function, you can just upload, you can register a Python function, but we're using containers, Docker mostly, and there's work going on with Singularity. I'm not sure, I can't remember the status of that.
I had a small question as well. For the open source tool which you're allowing others to use, where they're able to download large data sets onto their local system, if they need to. Have you looked into anything when it comes to like actually for using the data in a deep learning application, for example, you need to annotate these huge data sets. Have you looked into anything about how it would be possible to realistically annotate extremely large data sets like this or anything like that?
Right, so I mean, I'm involved in quite a few projects that are doing that, but we're not particularly integrated with the Globus environment, I'd say.
Okay.
Just move the data and we run big parallel computations to do the annotation. I've had a student who's been doing some wonderful work on unsupervised learning of cloud classes from Modis data. So the first thing we did was spend 3 months moving all the NASA Modis data to Argonne. They didn't have a Globus endpoint, so it was very painful. And then he's just running his own programs.
That's really cool. What's the project called by any chance? Is there any, you could check it out? Like what the students want.
Classification? Yeah, why don't I give you the project?
Oh yeah, sure.
Particularly have a name. Probably should. Everything should have a name.
Thank you.
A catchy name, yes. Yeah.
I have a question on data accessibility. You mentioned earlier that there was kind of like a federal approval when you want to access data. How are you guys managing that?
I don't remember what I said about federal approvals, but so just talking generally, I mean, all data funded by federal research, I think, for much data is supposed to be openly shared, and what that means, of course, varies tremendously. And certainly, some data is access controlled, so like clinical data. So we do have quite a few people in medical centers that use Globus. We run a version of it that's set up to be, or in a very, very general term, HIPAA compliant, which basically means that we follow certain policies, and in operating it, it doesn't prevent. You still need to do all the other HIPAA stuff. And then, of course, it's easy to set up in. Maybe this is what I was saying. The Globus APIs and make it easy to create a storage location, define a group of people who are out to access the data on it, move data into it, modify those storage permissions, those access permissions over time and so forth. So it's a natural way of implementing certain controlled data sharing scenarios.
Chris, do you have a question in the chat?
No, I think the virtual audience kind of cycled out at noon.
So maybe I'll ask one more question, because you mentioned about the pendulum, the mode of computing swinging back and forth. I was just wondering, the DOE labs and Argonne labs has always been major players or leaders for HPC supercomputing. What do you see the direction of the pendulum swinging back and forth? Where are we going?
Right. So Argonne has been one of the labs that's been really driving big computers, including our new Aurora system, and always pushing the extremes of allowing for very large scale simulation. People are doing fascinating things with that capability. And now we have a new set of workloads that relate to very large scale machine AI model training, which I think is also very interesting, and they'll be good for that. But it's still a fairly narrow set of the population of the physical sciences research community. So what I think interests me and many others is, well, what is the computing infrastructure we should create so that every experimental scientist has access to as much computing as they want when they need it? And I don't think people quite know how to do that. One of the issues is who's going to pay for it.
Yes.
what people call mid-range, what's called mid-range computing. But, you know, we do have, this is very parochial and local, but we have now permission from DOE to start using a substantial fraction of our new computers to support experimental science as well as simulation science. So I think that's a step in the right. All right. Thanks for the great questions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you.